Sarah Thompson's day had started 18 hours ago, and it showed. Her usually neat curls were pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her casual clothes, jeans, a navy sweater, and comfortable flats, felt out of place in the Grand Metropolitan Courthouse. But after spending all night monitoring a suspect from her unmarked car, she hadn't had time to go home and change into her usual professional attire. The large clock above the courthouse entrance read 8:54 a.m. Sarah had exactly 6 minutes to make it to courtroom 4B, where she needed to present crucial evidence in a corruption case she'd been investigating for the past 8 months. Her team had finally gathered enough proof to expose several judges who had been accepting bribes to dismiss cases. Just great, Sarah muttered to herself, fumbling with her phone to silence it while juggling her heavy case files. At 34, she was one of the youngest lead investigators in the department's history, and her current case could make or break her career. The security line stretched longer than usual that morning. Sarah watched anxiously as each person ahead of her slowly removed their belts, shoes, and metal objects. A young mother struggled with a stroller while her toddler wailed. Sarah checked the time again, 8:57 a.m. "Ma'am, you're next," called the security guard, a familiar face Sarah usually greeted each morning. Today, however, he didn't recognize her without her usual suit and detective's badge, which was currently buried in her shoulder bag along with her service weapon. Sarah quickly placed her bag on the scanner belt and walked through the metal detector. It beeped loudly, causing several heads to turn in her direction. She remembered the small metal hair clip holding her ponytail in place. "Step back and remove any metal items, please," the guard instructed professionally. Sarah complied, her hands slightly shaking as she removed the clip. The clock now showed 8:59 a.m. After passing through successfully on her second try, she grabbed her bag and files, not bothering to put her hair clip back in as she rushed toward the elevator. The ancient elevator seemed to move slower than usual, stopping at every floor despite Sarah repeatedly pressing the button for the fourth floor. When it finally reached her destination, she practically sprinted down the marble hallway, her flats making soft pattering sounds against the floor. Just as she rounded the corner near courtroom 4B, a stern voice stopped her in her tracks. "Young lady, this is a courthouse, not a shopping mall." Sarah turned to face the voice and found herself looking at Judge William Barrett, known throughout the legal community for his strict demeanor and traditional views. His steel-gray hair and black robes seemed to amplify his authoritative presence. "I apologize, Your Honor, but I'm running late for—" Sarah began, trying to catch her breath. Silence. Judge Barrett cut her off, his face reddening with anger. "Your attire is completely inappropriate for this institution, and running in the halls? This is absolutely unacceptable behavior." Sarah opened her mouth to explain, but the judge raised his hand to stop her. Several passers-by slowed down to watch the scene unfold, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. "I'm imposing an immediate fine of $250 for contempt of court," Judge Barrett declared, pulling out his citation pad. "Your casual disregard for this institution and its protocols is exactly what's wrong with young people today." Sarah stood perfectly still, her expression carefully neutral despite the anger and frustration building inside her. She'd faced similar assumptions before in her line of work. This was different. The judge hadn't even given her a chance to identify herself. "Your name?" Judge Barrett demanded, pen poised over the citation pad. "Detective Sarah Thompson," she replied calmly, reaching for her badge in her bag. "I'm actually here to—" "Save your excuses for someone who cares," the judge interrupted again, scribbling on the pad. "Take this citation to the clerk's office on the first floor, and next time, dress appropriately for court." He thrust the citation into her hand and strode away, his robe swishing dramatically behind him. Sarah looked down at the paper, then at her watch. It was now 9:03 a.m., and she was officially late for her hearing, in Judge Barrett's own courtroom. A slight smile played at the corners of her mouth as she tucked the citation into her case file. In just a few minutes, Judge Barrett would learn exactly who she was, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder how he would react when she stepped up to present her evidence as the lead investigator in one of the biggest judicial corruption cases in the city's history. Sarah Thompson straightened her shoulders as she walked into courtroom 4B, her case files clutched tightly against her chest. The room was already packed with attorneys, journalists, and curious onlookers. This was, after all, one of the biggest corruption cases the city had seen in decades. Assistant District Attorney Mark Rodriguez spotted her entering and quickly made his way over. "Where have you been?" he whispered urgently. "Judge Barrett is in a terrible mood this morning. He's already threatened to hold 2 lawyers in contempt." Sarah couldn't help but smile. "Oh, I know all about his mood," she replied, pulling out the fresh citation from her file. Mark's eyes widened as he read it. "He fined you, without even knowing who you are?" Mark shook his head in disbelief. "This is going to be interesting." Before Sarah could respond, the bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. "All rise, the Honorable Judge William Barrett presiding." The crowd rose as Judge Barrett swept into the room, his black robes flowing behind him. He took his seat at the bench, shuffling through some papers without looking up at the assembled crowd. "Be seated," he commanded, still focused on his papers. "We're here today for case number 2024 CR 789, the State versus James Morton, regarding allegations of judicial corruption. Is the prosecution ready to proceed?" Mark stood up. "Yes, Your Honor. The State is ready with our lead investigator present to provide key evidence." Judge Barrett nodded impatiently. "Very well, call your first witness." "The State calls Detective Sarah Thompson to the stand," Mark announced clearly. The judge's head snapped up at the name, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Sarah. His face, already naturally ruddy, turned a deeper shade of red as recognition dawned. Sarah maintained her composure as she walked to the front of the courtroom, her badge now prominently displayed on her belt. The bailiff approached with a Bible, and Sarah placed her left hand on it, raising her right hand for the oath. She could feel Judge Barrett's uncomfortable gaze on her throughout the process. "Please state your name and position for the record," Mark began. "Detective Sarah Thompson, lead investigator with the department's Special Investigations Unit," she replied clearly, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. From his position on the bench, Judge Barrett shifted in his seat. The citation he'd written less than 15 minutes ago felt like it was burning a hole in Sarah's pocket. "Detective Thompson," Mark continued, "please share your credentials with the court before we proceed with your findings." Sarah sat straighter in the witness chair. "I've been with the department for 12 years, the last 5 as a detective. I've led 27 major corruption investigations with a 93% conviction rate. I have a master's degree in criminal justice from State University, and I've received multiple commendations for my work, including the Mayor's Excellence in Service Award last year." The journalists in the gallery scribbled furiously in their notepads. Judge Barrett's discomfort was now visible to everyone in the courtroom, his earlier self-righteous anger replaced by something that looked remarkably like embarrassment. "Thank you, Detective," Mark said. "Now, please tell us about the investigation that brings us here today." Sarah opened her case file, the same one she'd been carrying during her encounter with Judge Barrett in the hallway. 8 months ago, our unit received an anonymous tip about certain judges accepting bribes to dismiss cases. Through extensive surveillance, financial tracking, and undercover operations, we've uncovered a network of corruption that reaches the highest levels of our judicial system. She paused, making brief eye contact with Judge Barrett before continuing. "We have documented evidence of 5 judges accepting bribes ranging from $10,000 to $250,000 to manipulate case outcomes. Ironically, Your Honor, the amount of these bribes makes the $250 citation I received in the hallway this morning seem rather insignificant." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Barrett's face had now lost all its color, and he gripped the edges of his bench tightly. The same man who had berated her for her appearance less than 20 minutes ago now had to sit and listen as she presented evidence that would bring down several of his colleagues. Sarah pulled out her detailed reports and photographs, ready to continue her testimony. In that moment, she wasn't thinking about revenge or satisfaction. She was focused on justice, not just for the corruption she'd uncovered, but for anyone who had ever been judged unfairly based on their appearance or assumptions about who they were. The courtroom fell silent as Sarah Thompson began presenting her evidence. She pulled out several photographs from her file and handed them to the court clerk to be displayed on the large screen at the front of the room. "These images were taken over the past 6 months," Sarah explained, her voice steady and professional. "They show Judge Michael Freeman meeting with James Morton in various parking lots and restaurants across the city. Judge Barrett leaned forward, his earlier embarrassment temporarily forgotten as he studied the clear surveillance photos. The images showed a man in judicial robes accepting an envelope in a dimly lit parking garage. "And what was in these envelopes, Detective Thompson?" Mark Rodriguez asked. "Cash payments," Sarah replied, pulling out another document. "Our financial analysis shows deposits matching these meeting dates in Judge Freeman's offshore account. Each deposit ranged from $50,000 to $100,000. From his seat at the defense table, James Morton shifted uncomfortably. His expensive suit and confident demeanor couldn't hide the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Sarah continued her testimony, laying out 8 months of careful investigation work. She explained how her team had tracked money movements, recorded conversations, and built a solid case against the corrupt judges. Throughout her presentation, she maintained her composure, even when her eyes met Judge Barrett's uncomfortable gaze. "We also discovered something particularly disturbing," Sarah said, reaching for another file. "These corrupt judges seem to target cases involving minority defendants, believing their complaints about unfair treatment would be less likely to be taken seriously." The irony of this statement wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom, especially given the morning's events. Several journalists exchanged meaningful glances, their pens moving rapidly across their notepads. Judge Barrett cleared his throat. "Detective Thompson," he interrupted, his voice lacking its earlier authority. "Could you clarify the timeline of these investigations?" Sarah turned to face him directly. "Certainly, Your Honor. Our surveillance began exactly 8 months ago. In fact, I was completing an overnight surveillance operation this morning, which explains my casual attire." She patted the citation in her pocket. Sometimes appearances can be deceiving. A quiet murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Barrett's face flushed again, but he remained silent. Sarah stood and walked to the evidence table, pulling out a laptop. "With the court's permission, I'd like to play several recorded conversations between Mr. Morton and the accused judges." Objection. Morton's defense attorney jumped to his feet. "These recordings were obtained without my client's knowledge." "All recordings were made with proper warrants, Your Honor," Sarah responded calmly, holding up a stack of documents. "Signed by Judge Anderson from the federal court, specifically to avoid any potential conflicts of interest with local judges." Judge Barrett had no choice but to overrule the objection. As Sarah played the recordings, the courtroom listened in shocked silence to judges openly discussing price tags for dismissing cases. One recording even captured a judge laughing about how easy it was to dismiss cases against minority defendants without raising suspicions. Throughout the presentation, Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, but she couldn't help noticing how Judge Barrett seemed to sink lower in his chair with each passing minute. The man who had so quickly judged her based on her appearance was now witnessing firsthand how appearances and assumptions could mask deeper truths. As she concluded her testimony, Sarah organized her files neatly. "Our investigation has uncovered corruption involving 5 judges, 15 lawyers, and over 30 cases that were improperly dismissed. The total amount of bribes exchanged exceeds $2 million. The gallery erupted in whispers. Judge Barrett banged his gavel, calling for order, but his hands were shaking slightly. "Detective Thompson," Mark asked his final question. "In your professional opinion, how deep does this corruption go?" Sarah stood straight, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom before landing on Judge Barrett. "Based on our evidence, we've only scratched the surface. This case demonstrates how vital it is to look beyond surface appearances and quick judgments to find the truth." As she stepped down from the witness stand, Sarah couldn't help but notice that Judge Barrett was no longer meeting her eyes. The same man who had felt entitled to fine her that morning now seemed to be grappling with his own prejudices and assumptions, all while the weight of her investigation threatened to bring down the very system he represented. The afternoon session of court began with an unexpected twist. As Sarah Thompson prepared to present more evidence, a commotion erupted outside the courtroom doors. 2 police officers escorted Judge Michael Freeman, one of the judges implicated in the corruption case, through the doors in handcuffs. Judge Barrett's face turned pale. Michael Freeman had been his friend and golf partner for the past 15 years. "Your Honor," Mark Rodriguez addressed Judge Barrett, "the state requests permission to add this new development to Detective Thompson's testimony." Judge Barrett nodded slowly, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Proceed, he said quietly. Sarah stood again, her casual clothes now forgotten as all eyes focused on the power of her evidence. She pulled out a fresh file marked Urgent in red letters. Judge Freeman was arrested 30 minutes ago while attempting to withdraw all funds from his accounts, Sarah explained. Our surveillance team tracked him to Metro City Bank, where he tried to empty his safety deposit box containing $475,000 in cash. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. James Morton, the main defendant, loosened his tie nervously. Detective Thompson, Mark asked, could you explain how you coordinated such a complex operation? Sarah walked to the evidence table and spread out a large chart. This investigation required careful planning and timing. We had teams monitoring all 5 suspected judges today, knowing that news of this hearing might cause them to panic. She pointed to different sections of the chart, explaining how her team had worked around the clock. Despite her tired appearance and casual clothes, her expertise shone through every word. We placed surveillance teams at every major bank in the city, she continued. Judge Freeman's attempt to flee was exactly what we expected. Sometimes, Your Honor, she glanced at Judge Barrett, the most reliable evidence comes when people underestimate us. Judge Barrett shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the memory of their morning encounter still fresh. Sarah then revealed a series of text messages on the courtroom screen. They showed conversations between the corrupt judges, warning each other about investigations. These messages were exchanged this morning, she explained. Judge Freeman's arrest has already led to 2 other judges attempting to flee. They're being taken into custody as we speak. The gallery erupted in gasps and murmurs. Judge Barrett banged his gavel weakly, trying to maintain order. Mark Rodriguez stepped forward. Detective Thompson, how did your team manage to intercept these messages? We had court-approved wiretaps on their phones, Sarah replied. But the most damaging evidence came from their own arrogance. They were so confident in their position and power that they barely tried to hide their actions. She played a recording of Judge Freeman bragging about how no one would dare investigate a judge. The irony of his words echoed through the silent courtroom. As Sarah continued presenting evidence, several journalists slipped out to break the story. Within hours, the news of judges being arrested would rock the entire city. Judge Barrett watched as Sarah methodically laid out more evidence: bank statements, surveillance photos, and witness testimonies. The same woman he had dismissed as unprofessional that morning was now dismantling the corrupt system some of his colleagues had built. Your Honor, Sarah said, addressing Judge Barrett directly, we have one more piece of evidence to present. She pulled out a familiar-looking citation, the one he had given her that morning. This citation, issued to me today, will be included in our report as an example of how appearances and prejudices can affect judgment even in our highest courts. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Barrett's hands trembled as he reached for his water glass. Sarah continued, her voice firm but not unkind. This case isn't just about bribery and corruption. It's about the deeper issue of judgment, who we choose to trust, who we choose to dismiss, and how these choices can corrupt justice itself. As she finished speaking, the bailiff handed her a note. Sarah read it quickly, then addressed the court again. I've just been informed that 2 more judges have turned themselves in, along with 3 defense attorneys involved in the scheme. They're requesting to cooperate with our investigation. Judge Barrett looked around his courtroom, seeing it with new eyes. The woman he had fined for her appearance had just orchestrated one of the largest judicial takedowns in the city's history, all while wearing jeans and a sweater. The next morning, Sarah Thompson's face was splashed across every newspaper in the city. Headlines screamed, "Detective uncovers massive judicial corruption," and Judge finds his own investigator. A tale of prejudice and power. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since the previous day's court session. Sarah sat at her desk in the Special Investigations Unit, still wearing her casual clothes from another overnight surveillance. Her team members kept stopping by, some offering congratulations, others sharing their own stories of being judged unfairly. Detective Thompson, a young officer, appeared at her door. The chief wants to see you immediately. Sarah found Police Chief Martinez waiting in his office with several important-looking people. Among them was Janet Chen, the head of the Judicial Review Board, and Michael Roberts, the district attorney. Please, sit down, Detective, Chief Martinez said, smiling warmly. Or should I say, Future Captain Thompson? Sarah blinked in surprise. Captain. Your handling of the corruption case was exceptional, Janet Chen spoke up. But what's really caught our attention is how you handled the incident with Judge Barrett. You showed remarkable professionalism in a situation where many would have reacted differently. The district attorney nodded in agreement. The citation incident has started important conversations about bias in our justice system. Sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected places. Sarah thought about Judge Barrett's face when he realized his mistake. What's happening with the judges who were arrested? She asked. 3 have already agreed to cooperate, Chief Martinez replied. They're providing information about other corrupt officials. This goes deeper than we initially thought. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed with a news alert. Judge Barrett had called an emergency press conference. They turned on the office television to watch. Judge Barrett stood at the courthouse steps, looking tired and humbled. Yesterday's events have forced me to confront my own biases, he began. My treatment of Detective Thompson was unprofessional and prejudiced. I failed to look beyond appearances, the very thing we judges are sworn to avoid. Sarah watched silently as the judge continued his public apology. Her team gathered around the TV, some shaking their heads, others nodding in approval. Detective, Janet Chen said, turning away from the television, we'd like you to lead a new task force. Your investigation revealed not just corruption, but deep-rooted prejudices in our system. We need someone who understands both issues. Sarah thought about all the people who had been wronged by corrupt judges, all the cases that needed reviewing. What exactly would this task force do? Everything, the district attorney said. Review suspicious cases, investigate other potential corruption, and most importantly, help develop new protocols to prevent bias in our courts. Chief Martinez handed her a folder. The promotion to captain comes with it. You'll have full authority to choose your team and run investigations your way. As they discussed the details, Sarah's phone kept buzzing. Messages poured in from other detectives sharing their own stories of being judged by appearance. One female detective wrote about being mistaken for a secretary, another about being questioned at a crime scene despite showing her badge. There's something else, Janet Chen added. Judge Barrett has requested to work with your task force as an advisor. He wants to help identify potential bias in judicial decisions. Are you comfortable with that? Sarah remembered the judge's face when she presented her evidence, how his arrogance had turned to understanding. Yes, she said finally. Sometimes the best advocates for change are people who have recognized their own mistakes. Later that afternoon, Sarah walked through the courthouse hallway where Judge Barrett had stopped her just yesterday. Officers and lawyers who had witnessed her humiliation now nodded respectfully as she passed. A young black female lawyer stopped her. Detective Thompson, the lawyer said quietly, thank you. Your story, it's made people listen to our experiences in a new way. Sarah smiled, touching the citation she still kept in her pocket. Sometimes justice worked in unexpected ways. The same citation meant to shame her had become a powerful symbol of the changes needed in their justice system. As she headed back to her office to start planning her new task force, Sarah passed a mirror in the hallway. She was still wearing casual clothes, her badge now joined by a captain's insignia. Her reflection smiled back at her, a reminder that true authority came not from appearances, but from actions and integrity. 1 week after the dramatic court revelations, Judge William Barrett sat alone in his chambers, staring at the growing pile of case files on his desk. Each file represented a case that needed review, decisions made by his now arrested colleagues. The magnitude of the corruption was becoming clearer with each passing day. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he called, expecting his clerk. Instead, Captain Sarah Thompson entered, carrying even more files. Good morning, Your Honor, she said professionally. The task force has identified another 100 cases that need immediate review. Judge Barrett gestured to a chair. The same woman he had fined for her appearance a week ago now commanded the respect of the entire courthouse. Today, she wore a crisp suit, but he had noticed she sometimes still came in wearing casual clothes during surveillance operations. Nobody dared comment on her appearance anymore. Captain Thompson, he began, his voice heavy with regret. I've been thinking about that morning, about how quickly I judged you, how easily I abused my authority. Sarah placed the files on his desk. Your internal review hearing is scheduled for tomorrow, isn't it? He nodded. Several judges had filed complaints about his treatment of Sarah, calling for his removal from the bench. The irony wasn't lost on him. He might lose his position not for corruption, but for revealing his prejudices. 6 of the corrupted judges have now confessed, Sarah informed him. They're providing details about cases going back 5 years. Over 300 families were affected by their corrupt decisions. The judge picked up one of the files. Inside was a photo of a young black man who had been sentenced to 6 years for a crime he didn't commit. The real criminal had paid a judge to direct suspicion toward the innocent man. I've been on the bench for 20 years, Judge Barrett said quietly. How many times did I let my own biases affect my decisions? How many people did I judge unfairly, just like I judged you? Sarah remained silent, letting him work through his thoughts. The Judicial Review Board wants to use my citation incident as a teaching case, she finally said. They think it perfectly illustrates how bias can exist, even in people who believe they're being fair. Just then, the door opened again. Janet Chen from the Judicial Review Board entered, followed by several other officials. Judge Barrett, Janet said formally, the board has reviewed your conduct and the recommendations for your removal. However, we've also received an unexpected letter. She handed him an envelope. As he read the letter, his eyes widened in surprise. Captain Thompson wrote this, he asked, looking up at Sarah. Janet nodded. She believes you would be more valuable on the bench, helping to identify and correct bias, than removed from it. She thinks your experience could help other judges recognize their own prejudices. Judge Barrett looked at Sarah, remembering how differently he had seen her just a week ago. Why would you support me staying on the bench? Because, Sarah replied, real change doesn't come from punishing people who show their biases. It comes from helping people recognize and correct them. Janet Chen placed another document on the judge's desk. Instead of removal, we're offering you a choice. You can either step down voluntarily, or you can join Captain Thompson's task force as a judicial advisor, helping to review cases and train other judges about bias. The judge looked at the citation he had written to Sarah, now framed on his wall as a reminder. If I stay, he said slowly, I want to start by reviewing all my own past decisions. Every single case where I might have let bias affect my judgment. Sarah nodded approvingly. We'll need to establish new protocols for the entire court system, clear guidelines about behavior, appearance policies that don't discriminate, training programs about unconscious bias. Judge Barrett stood up and faced Janet Chen. I accept the position with the task force, and I'd owe Captain Thompson more than just an apology. I owe it to her, and to justice itself, to do better. As they left his chambers, the judge watched Sarah talking with her team in the hallway. The same hallway where he had tried to humiliate her was now where she led the fight for a fairer justice system. Sometimes, he realized, the best lessons came from our biggest mistakes, a reminder that true authority came not from appearances, but from actions and integrity. 3 months after the corruption scandal, the Metropolitan Courthouse looked very different. Signs posted throughout the building read, Justice sees evidence, not appearance. Captain Sarah Thompson smiled as she passed one of these posters on her way to conduct the morning training session. The main conference room was packed. Judges, lawyers, and court officers filled every seat, with more standing along the walls. At the front of the room, Judge Barrett waited nervously. This would be his first time co-presenting with Sarah for the mandatory bias training program. Good morning, Sarah began, scanning the room. Today's session isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about recognizing how unconscious bias affects our justice system. Judge Barrett stepped forward. Many of you know about my encounter with Captain Thompson 3 months ago. Today, I'm not speaking as a judge, but as someone who learned a difficult lesson about prejudice. The room fell silent as he shared the story of that morning, how he had fined Sarah without letting her identify herself, how his assumptions had clouded his judgment. Several judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps remembering their own similar mistakes. But this isn't just about appearance, Sarah continued, clicking to the next slide. In the past 3 months, our task force has reviewed over 500 cases. We found bias in sentencing, in bail decisions, even in how different lawyers were treated in court. She displayed a chart showing disparities in sentencing between different racial and social groups. The numbers told a clear story of systemic bias. Yesterday, Judge Barrett added, I reversed one of my own decisions from last year. I had given a harsher sentence to a young man largely because his appearance and demeanor annoyed me. Looking back, I realize I let my biases override justice. A young public defender raised her hand. But how do we check our biases in the moment? When we're busy and making quick decisions. Sarah pulled out the citation Judge Barrett had given her, now laminated and used as a teaching tool. This citation represents a decision made in less than 2 minutes. That's often all it takes for bias to affect judgment. She and Judge Barrett then led the group through exercises designed to reveal unconscious bias. They showed photos of different people and asked the audience to make quick judgments, then revealed surprising truths about each person's actual role and background. The point isn't to shame anyone, Sarah explained. It's to help us recognize when we're making assumptions based on appearance, race, gender, or social status. During a break, a court clerk approached Sarah. Captain Thompson, she said quietly, I was here that morning when Judge Barrett fined you. I didn't say anything then, and I felt guilty ever since. Sarah touched the clerk's arm gently. That's exactly why we're doing this training. Change happens when people start speaking up. As the session continued, Judge Barrett shared new courthouse protocols his team had developed with Sarah's help. These included mandatory waiting periods for contempt citations, regular review of sentencing patterns, anonymous reporting system for bias incidents, required diversity training for all court personnel. These changes aren't just about following new rules, Sarah emphasized. They're about creating a justice system that truly serves everyone equally. At the end of the session, Janet Chen from the Judicial Review Board made a surprise appearance. Thanks to Captain Thompson's task force and Judge Barrett's cooperation, our courthouse is becoming a model for other jurisdictions. Next month, they'll be presenting this training program at the National Judicial Conference. As people filed out of the room, many stopped to share their own stories of experiencing or witnessing bias. Sarah noticed Judge Barrett listening intently to each person, taking notes, showing a humility that would have seemed impossible 3 months ago. Later that afternoon, Sarah walked through the courthouse hallway where everything had started. A young black woman in casual clothes rushed past her, clearly late for something. Excuse me, Sarah called out. Are you looking for a courtroom? The woman turned, worried. Yes, I'm supposed to testify, but I came straight from my night shift and didn't have time to change. Sarah smiled, pinned her captain's badge to her own casual surveillance clothes, and said, Let me walk with you. I think I can help explain things to the judge. Sometimes, she thought, the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of understanding. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning when Judge Barrett had fined Sarah Thompson. The Metropolitan Courthouse had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. Today was going to be another landmark day, the official launch of the Justice Equality Initiative, a program that would spread nationwide. Sarah, now promoted to Deputy Commissioner of Special Investigations, stood at the podium in the courthouse's main hall. Camera flashes lit up the room as reporters gathered to cover the event. Behind her sat Judge Barrett, along with officials from 20 other states who had come to learn from their experience. 6 months ago, Sarah began, a simple citation became a catalyst for change. She held up the now famous citation, smiling slightly. But this story isn't about one judge's mistake or one detective's experience. It's about the thousands of people who faced unfair judgment in our courts. She gestured to a wall where hundreds of photos hung, people whose cases have been reviewed and overturned in the past 6 months. Families reunited, lives restored, justice finally served. Thanks to our task force's work, Sarah continued, we've overturned 342 wrongful convictions. We've identified and removed 12 corrupt judges across the state, but more importantly, we changed how our courts operate. Judge Barrett stepped up to the podium next. He looked different now, humbler, more thoughtful. When I wrote that citation 6 months ago, he said, I thought I was enforcing respect for the court. Instead, I was demonstrating exactly what was wrong with our system. He turned to face Sarah. Deputy Commissioner Thompson taught us that true respect for justice comes not from appearances, but from fairness, integrity, and the courage to admit our mistakes. The audience applauded as Sarah unveiled a new courthouse policy document. Starting today, every courthouse in our state will implement these updated guidelines. They include fair dress codes that don't discriminate, mandatory bias training, and new oversight procedures. Janet Chen from the Judicial Review Board stepped forward with a surprising announcement. The success of Deputy Commissioner Thompson's program has caught national attention. The Supreme Court has requested a presentation of your training program next month. Sarah smiled, remembering how far they'd come. She watched as Judge Barrett handed out the first copies of Beyond Appearances, a guide to fair justice, a manual he had written based on their experiences. The same man who had once fined her for her casual clothes was now leading the fight against judicial bias. A young lawyer raised her hand during the Q&A session. "Deputy Commissioner, do you still keep that citation?" "I do," Sarah replied, "but not out of anger or resentment. I keep it as a reminder that change is possible, that someone who once judged me unfairly became one of our strongest allies in fighting discrimination." Judge Barrett added, "And I keep a copy in my chambers to remind me to look beyond my first impressions. Every time I'm tempted to make a quick judgment, I remember that morning." After the ceremony, Sarah walked through the courthouse hallways. She passed a diverse group of people, some in suits, others in work clothes, all being treated with equal respect by court officials. In one courtroom, she noticed a judge patiently listening to a woman in hospital scrubs who had come directly from her night shift. "Quite a change," Judge Barrett said, joining her in the hallway. "You know, they're using our story in law schools now as a case study in bias and reform." Sarah nodded, watching a public defender in casual clothes confidently walking into court. The real success will be when this becomes so normal that no one remembers it was ever different. As they walked together, they passed the spot where their confrontation had occurred 6 months ago. The courthouse had installed a plaque there that read, "Justice sees with the heart, not just the eyes." "Ready for the Supreme Court presentation next month?" Judge Barrett asked. Sarah smiled, touching her deputy commissioner's badge. "Yes, and I might just wear jeans that day." They both laughed, knowing that the true measure of their success wasn't in the clothes people wore or the titles they held, but in the fairness of the justice they delivered. What had started with a simple citation had grown into a movement that was changing the face of justice itself, one courtroom, one decision, one person at a time.